Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel John Barrett on the Air Force Future Strategic Assessments team. What I do is I work with the intelligence community, academia, federally funded research and development centers to look at what our blue capabilities are and balance them against what our red adversaries are to help develop net assessments for the future fight. Today, we'll be talking to you a little bit about logistics under attack. With that, I'll turn it over to Colonel Sleeper to introduce herself.
Thanks so much. Good morning. I'm Colonel Maggie Sleeper. I'm on the headquarters A4L staff. And for the last year, I've had the pleasure of being a co-lead on the Logistics Under Attack cross-functional team. It's been a whirlwind year of learning about capability development, about logistics under attack, about the POM process, and concepts and strategies. So I'm looking forward to this conversation as it's been near and dear to my heart and all of our hearts for the last year. Over.
Colonel Steeves.
Yeah, this is Colonel Jeff Steeves. I'm the team leader here for Generating Combat Power Cross-Functional Team at Air Force Futures. This is in Center 2, which is our capability development branch of Air Force Futures. I'm a bomber pilot by trade, and have also spent some time working over in Korea on the staff, and then also as an Olmsted scholar. The things that we focus on most in our team are agile combat employment, and also the next generation of UAVs, or autonomous collaborative platforms.
Thank you, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Nolan.
Thanks, Lieutenant Colonel Barrett. I'm Lieutenant Colonel John Nolan, assigned to Center 1 in the Skunks. I'm the lead author for the Logistics Under Attack concept. Over the last year and a half, I've had a great opportunity to kind of understand what the threat is out there in the future fight, and trying to author and codify that, and how we as logisticians need to apply new emerging technologies to ensure that we can generate combat missions in a future fight. Thanks, Lieutenant Colonel Barrett. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. So, Colonel Steeves, we'll start with you. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been an evolving shift in what we see as our threats. The 2018 really kind of came back and highlighted the return of great power competition. What do you see as different about the threats from yesterday to the threats of tomorrow? Over.
All right, JB. Yeah, I guess we're not going to start out with a softball question or anything like that, but I guess to try to directly answer your question, I really think it depends on what we consider to be yesterday. If we look back to yesterday being World War II, or the post-World War II years and the Cold War, I think there's a lot of similarities between the world we live in now and then, particularly in the post-World War II world and the Cold War, where we had two major superpowers and we had to honor the Soviet threat on a day-to-day basis. If yesterday begins in November of 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think our world today looks considerably different. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the U.S. enjoyed, really unmatched conventional firepower, and was able to, from a logistical point of view, mass up our troops and then unleash them at a time of our choosing. So if you look back to Desert Storm, for example, we were able to bring in 600,000 troops plus materiel into Saudi Arabia to prepare for attacks while everybody was kind of watching us do that. I mean, it was a logistical marvel for sure to be able to do that, but that is really, really different from how we'll need to operate in our current paradigm. So in a lot of ways, if we were to take yesterday as being, during the Cold War, it's back to the future for us. We were actually looking back to World War II and the Cold War to steal pages from these playbooks. There's an operation back from World War II called Project Ivory Soap, kind of an interesting name, but really what that consisted of was 6 Liberty ships. Were basically floating repair units to support B-29 maintenance during the island hopping campaign. And then if we were to think about the Cold War, we've got a senior mentor here assigned to Air Force Futures, and a former fighter pilot that was flying around during the Cold War. and he was regaling me with stories about what it was like to land his F4 on the Autobahn, in Europe. Can you imagine today, us taking an F-22 or an F-35 and landing it here on like I-95 or something like that? I think that's a skill set that we have had in the past, but it's something that we haven't been thinking about. It's kind of fallen out of the acceptable level of risk that we've been willing to take. So, creating an agile force is one of the chief's top priorities, and our team is working hard to figure out a way to implement that cultural change. And the logistical side of the house is a huge portion to getting all of that squared away.
Hey, sir, thank you for those remarks. I think what you came back and highlighted is this isn't new. We are just relearning old things. So with that, Colonel Sleeper, we'll talk to these new threats. You've been involved with this for the last few years. How have you seen the logistics community evolve their culture to kind of get at some of these threats? Over, ma'am.
Thanks so much, JB. So I think Fletch kind of started to touch on what was a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about with this. So I guess we have to ask, how much has the logistics community really evolved in the last few years? We've been told to evolve, but in some ways I would argue that the Air Force financial decisions that have driven most logistics organizations to kind of prioritize efficiency and cost reduction over some of their operational effects. It's sort of in turn created a situation where we want to change, but perhaps haven't been able to do as much as we'd want to do. And it can be a hard trade. It's hard to articulate risk to current operational missions when we're constantly fighting that uphill battle of the POM. So asking ourselves, I think our biggest hurdle to addressing these new threats would be realizing that we have a cultural shift. And asking ourselves, are we willing to take the risks in today's fight to evolve where we really need to be? The world and the operations that we live in right now, as Fletch just stated, have become more complex, but sort of back to the future. But right now, certainly what's different is the speed of change is faster than in the previous years. So as a culture, we really have to become better at making decisions at the lowest level, perhaps without having all the information, and perhaps, as the chief just said in his recent release to the airmen, we have to be willing to accept that the senior leaders may not always have the best answer at the time, at that moment. And our logisticians need to shift their mindset as well, a mindset to become more active participants in shaping operations versus just kind of willing to wait for the requirement to be asked of them. And we have to be able, again, to communicate and assess that risk. Air Force leadership says the need to change is our biggest cultural shift. It's been explicitly directed by the CSAF in his Accelerate, Change, or Lose message to the force, and as he's published his action orders. But we have some work to do, and the change must start with our logisticians executing day-to-day operations to actualize that change. It's just words until we actually demonstrate those behaviors. And it's not that we haven't done anything. Our recent focus on innovation over the last few years has really realized some pretty cool things that are out there. We've got the URSUS tool that's been developed and is now being fielded and tested out there. The theory of constraints that a lot of folks in this forum have been kind of seeing popping up at their bases and wings. We're now training the trainer so that we're not reliant on the contractor to go one by one by one. And in many ways, I think the COVID paradigm has forced us to think differently, and we have responded to that. So current and future efforts to proliferate that ACE concept that Fletch is leading within the Generate Combat Power cross-functional team, that's going to help drive even more of that cultural change. But again, I do think we have some more work to do in this area. Over.
Man, thank you so much for that. So a lot of what we talk about with that cultural change is going to start with the logistics under attack concept. So John, I'll turn it over to you. You are in the Skunks here in Air Force Futures, writing strategy and concepts as an air power strategist. Over your time here in Air Force Futures, what have you seen as the biggest capability gaps that we need to overcome in logistics to support this future fight? Over.
Thanks, JB, for that question. First, I would say we first, as logisticians, need to pat ourselves on the back. And what I mean by that is all the great things we have done, you would automatically potentially determine that we don't need to change. But I would say that same hand that you pat yourself on the back, you need to push yourself forward. And why I say that is our adversaries have also seen the great things we've done. And they have said, and they have studied, and they have ensured that those same successes will not be realized in the future. So with that being said, I'll first like to acknowledge also that every respective theater will see capability gaps different based off where they're currently sitting at. However, with that said, I'd like to discuss 4 overarching capability gaps that I believe are the foundations of logistics under attack. The first being our ability to properly posture our force globally. Understanding that closing this capability gap will facilitate the transition from peacetime activities to respond effectively to combat operations that Colonel Steeves will speak to later. The success of closing this gap requires a few different things, including bolstering our networks with our allies and partners, as realized both in PACAF and USAFE, rotating as well as dispersing pre-positioned stocks, which is a change from how we currently warehouse items at particular main operating bases, as well as seeking opportunities to reduce our logistical demands via operational contracting support, as well as leveraging host nation support. Second, we need to look at our timely ability to deploy required resources from CONUS or other locations to point of need, as well as how are we going to sustain those distributed forces. Third is our ability to not only attempt to mitigate, but also effectively recover from enemy attack. And it's just not sitting there in our foxholes, but it's understanding that we need to come out and generate combat stories to put that same level of kinetic operations, if required, upon our adversaries. And then last but not least is our ability to exploit information, to expedite and exploit the ability for our decision makers to process at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels for logistic decisions to inform and influence joint force commander decisions. So those are the main 4 areas that we look at as capability gaps, with the understanding that under each one of those, there's additional capability gaps that will lead up to the overarching strategic aspect of each of those 4.
John, thank you so much for that. When we really talk about logistics under attack, it's ultimately going to be environmental, right? Where you are at different points in time and places kind of drives the threat. So Colonel Steeves, we see a lot about permissive environment, contested environment, highly contested environment. That means something different if you're at Kadena, or if you're in Ramstein, or if you're in McConnell Air Force Base, Kansas. So from your perspective, what are those? What do those mean to you? And then where do they begin and where do they end?
Okay, I guess to answer your question, JB, I'd like to point out that there's a definitional aspect here when we talk about the difference between permissive, contested, highly contested environments. And I guess the thing that I'd like to point out that really this is a spectrum that we're talking about, and it's really about the degree to which the enemy or the adversary can interfere with our operations. So you can imagine in a permissive environment, kind of like you were, that maybe that's Kansas, like you were talking about, but that's really in the situation where an adversary is really not capable of imposing, effective deterrence. I think effective or effective interference is probably the right term there. When I move on to contested, the adversary is capable of imposing effective interference in our operations. And then we get to highly contested environments. The adversary is capable of imposing prohibitive interference on our friendly forces, operations, and functions. So those are kind of the book answers in terms of like what the definitions are to a certain extent. I don't know if I can tell you exactly where that transition happens in between as you transition across Europe or when you move across the Pacific. But I can tell you, the ability to conduct operations and to sustain or supply becomes exponentially harder the closer that we get to the adversary's home turf. Back over to you.
Sir, thank you for that. I appreciate it. So, Colonel Sleeper, so we're talking about this spectrum of attack, right? Beginning with, some degree on the lower end of threat within the United States, going up to a higher degree of threat further out on the periphery. So when we look at our logistics systems and we talk about resiliency in our logistics systems, what does that mean to you, ma'am?
Thanks, JB. Well, again, there's a lot in there, and I could start with book answers of resilience and survivability, because I think in some cases they mean just little tweaks to different people. But if you use the two in a sentence together like that, resilience and survivability of our logistics systems, I see kind of a broader perspective than just not only being able to quickly recover and remain alive, our systems to be able to recover and remain alive, but certainly I think being postured and protected correctly might help initially. So, and again, we could go into posture and protection and what those mean. But I think with a resiliency of our systems, sometimes it means redundancy in our stocks. Sometimes it means having a reasonable explanation or expectation, I guess, of that precise replenishment. Sometimes it means that we need to understand the risks and prioritization of our systems and who might benefit from logistics as a whole. But I do think that resilience and survivability are the baseline of our ability to sustain our future fight. It kind of starts, in my perspective, with the acquisition process, which may not be near and dear to a lot of folks on this line's heart, but certainly we live with what the acquisition process gives us. So if we could have industry live up to our requirements for resilience and survivability in the first place when building those new systems, it could start with that. And I mean, we could use the F-35 and KC-46 as some pretty good examples of how sometimes it doesn't always happen right the first time or the second time or the third time, but as logisticians, we still have to work through that and make it work. I also think the resilience and survivability of our systems includes investing in supply chain risk management. And I think we'll probably talk to that a little bit later in this. But we need to know that our spare parts aren't being built by, or their company is owned by, the enemy, flat out. It also includes, I think, some protection of our distribution systems as well, so that we don't have another Maersk type incident. But as we look to provide resilience and survivability across the spectrum, from the high-end fight all the way back to the homeland, or even just our industrial base and what they provide, we have to keep in mind that all of this has a cost associated with them, and those costs are going to come at a risk to something else in another portfolio or some other area. So it's just, again, something to keep in mind as we think about how we build or enhance our logistics systems to be more resilient and survivable. Over.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. And I understand what you're talking about with the supply chain. It starts with the raw materials on the far left, and it goes all the way out to the airmen on the flight line. So what I'll take to continue that of logistics under attack. So John, we look at logistics under attack when we really get down to brass tacks for the 21X community, right? For the 2 Series 2X community, it's really talking about producing sorties while under attack. You've been overseas, you've commanded overseas. What does producing sorties under attack look like to you? And what should we as a community be thinking about in terms of that cultural shift that's we're going to need to do to get to that point? Over.
Hey, great question, JB. I've heard many a times the best defense sometimes is offense, and that's putting bombs forward on our adversary to ensure they're not putting them our way. Simply put, it means not only enabling our flight line to fight tonight, but as logisticians, I believe ensuring continued sustainment of those required resources across all sources of supply for us to win tomorrow. That's what we as logisticians allow our operators to win, is when they come back, regenerate those sorties only on day 2, day 3, and on to ensure we keep putting it downrange. That being said, our major source of supply I'd focus on ensuring 2 words already brought up by Colonel Sleeper are resiliency and survivability of our Class 3 POL and Class 5, our munitions. But we can't forget the criticality of our Class 9, our aircraft parts. And what I mean by that is pushing those parts, and again, I'll say it again, pushing those parts to the right aircraft mission and not to the right shelf. To the second part of your question, undoubtedly the future fight will require a cultural shift. I'd highlight one, acknowledgement that bases are fighting positions and not sanctuaries. That's a difference. That's a difference that we are not keen to always, but are getting back to it. And I think our airmen are learning a lot from that. Part 2 is both deployments and sustainment will be contested. Some of the key words were from the homeland. Deploying from a contested environment and understanding contested is not always cadet. There are multi-domains that we're going to be contested in that we need to battle through. Third is an increased need to balance prudent risk tolerance over risk aversion. You've heard it brought up before in respects to decisions being made at the lowest level. Are we willing to allow that? Because accountability will not necessarily shift, but the decision will. And that comes with a risk tolerance that sometimes people are not as comfortable with. But through training and practice, I believe we will get there. And fourth, and last but not least, we need to understand that there is going to be more dispersed operations away from main operating bases. That is going to create a more complex employment requirement, plus a sustainment requirement on us logisticians to ensure all those particular spokes are adequately sustained. Over.
Hey, thanks a lot, John. I think you brought up some really important points here. And one is, bases are fighting positions, right? So if I'm inside the first island chain, right? So the Cadenas, the Yakotas, or I'm back out at the second island chain at, say, Anderson Air Force Base, right? Or we take it over the European theater and we're looking at Ramstein and Spangdahlem. Those are fighting positions now. But it also talks about a difference, and I'll turn it over to you, Colonel Steeves. We talk about this inside versus outside fight dynamic. Can you explain what those mean and why we as logisticians should care about those terms?
Well, JB, I'll do my best here. I guess I'd start out by saying that with each passing day, the distinction between, the inside fight and the outside fight becomes a little less relevant as our adversary's ability to reach out and generate combat effects anywhere in the world, either kinetically or non-kinetically through cyber, continues to improve. So in other words, we are all best served by embracing what Lieutenant Colonel Nolan was just saying, that there is no sanctuary anywhere. And for a bomber guy like me, that's pretty hard to get used to. I look back to the most recent combat missions we had in the B2 community, and these were 35-hour combat missions to Libya. And the point is that they originated in Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and terminated in the same place. And we culturally in our community haven't had the idea to think, hey, Missouri, this is now a fighting position for us. It's in the center of the United States. So that's a big cultural shift, I think Lieutenant Colonel Nolan hit on it, and it's something that we just need to give a big bear hug to and start accepting as part of our identity here in the Department of the Air Force. I guess I guess more specifically answer your question, I think the terms like inside and outside are still very useful. Inside, generally speaking, means that there's an inside force operating, inside the adversary's A2AD, the anti-access area denial environment. So in other words, I guess really what I'm saying is that this inside force is within the range of the adversary's missiles. So thinking ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, maybe even hypersonics. So right now we are redesigning our forces to be able to operate under this threat umbrella. And that's really what the inside future force is all about, trying to make this inside force that is agile, dispersible, less dependent on runways. And ideally, all this is in concert with our critical allies and partners, right? So practically speaking, kind of like you were just talking to, JB, that, most of our bases in Europe are inside and vulnerable. In the Pacific, same thing can be said. And it's going to be real tough to do. It's getting increasingly tougher to do business inside the first or even the second island chains, like you mentioned. The outside force is, again, also a useful term, but it's really about generating forces outside the range of these missiles that we talked about. And it's, really, I guess I'll highlight that this is an all-domain approach. So outsiders are a mix, not just of long-range strike, like bombers and so on, but also standoff munitions, attritable platforms. That's one of the big things that we're working on our team, is developing the next generation of UAVs that are expendable to a certain extent, that can provide mass in air operations. But it also includes our space-based assets and also cyber. And essentially, the outside force's task is to link all these required links together to form a coherent kill chain. I guess the one thing that I would probably foot stomp in terms of why logisticians need to care about this is because it's super tough business. I would argue that, when we talk about this kill chain, that the most important link in this kill chain is the ability to sustain and supply our forces. I mean, I really think that from the logistician's point of view, this is going to be the challenge of your guys' lifetime. I know, from my point of view, it's daunting to figure out the operational portion, but gosh, sometimes I wake up and I'm happy that I don't have Colonel Sleeper's job, because it's a tough one. But anyways, those are my thoughts on that. I don't know if anybody else wants to pile on or move on to the next question. Back to you, JB.
So what we'll do is we'll go a little bit out of order, and I want to continue this thread. And so, John, I'm looking at you. You were the DO at Kadena, the LRS there a few years ago. You've seen this. You've heard this discussion. You've read the reports. Let's take you back. What would you be doing differently back at Kadena if you were to go back there today? Over.
Yeah, thanks, JB. Great time to deal at Kadena. I would tell you our perspective of where we looked was a little bit different in respect to what country we were looking at. But I would say I heard it many a times. You're 400 miles off the coast of China, which was an embracing fact to tell airmen to fully understand the significance of their job. But I would tell you, back in that environment, if I was so privileged to have that selection again, it would be training to execute our mission while under multi-domain attack. Can we perform our mission when it seems that it's seamlessly being accomplished with no bombs dropping? All beknownst to us, left of Bang, our adversaries have been attacking us via the cyber domain at a point that we cannot trust what our logistical systems are telling us that are inbound in respects to class 3, class 5, class 9 as parts, and in turn us telling our maintainers on a flight line that they have X parts coming in to be able to generate combat stories, when in reality that may not be true. So I would look at training in respects to including tactical camouflage, concealment, and deception, CC&D, which we have not done. Again, it's trying to get into our adversaries' OODA loop to understand what they're trying to attack, one, or what they are attacking does not impact us or diminish our ability to generate combat sorties. I would also increase localized dispersal operations, not only within the Kadena confines, but maybe outside as well, as we look at our allies and partners and where we can disperse combat capability or sustainment resources that could not be attacked by our adversary. And last but not least, executing training in a D-deal. And what I mean by D-deal is a degraded, disconnected, intermittent, or limited bandwidth environment. We do a lot of post-post operations as our comms are down, but this that we're looking at is something we have never seen before. Not only the ability to talk within the warehouse, but also our ability to talk to our maintainers on the flight line to ensure we are synchronized in an ability to meet our Joint Force Commander's requirement to get X amount of sorties off in X amount of time. It's going to be different, and the word we're going to hear time and time again is complex. But we have to get into an effort that we're comfortable with being uncomfortable. because whether we like it or not, we're going to be uncomfortable. Our adversary will ensure that. Additionally, you always have a reading cycle. You got to get it in the mind of your leadership, because at that point at Kadena, there will be very likely an opportunity. I, along with some of our airmen, will be making decisions that they never thought they would have to make before. So it's an understanding of what our leadership is looking for us to do. So it would be some readings I would recommend. The National Defense Strategy, mentioned a couple of times during this discussion, whichever is the most prevalent or the most current at that time, I would read. Understand what our national leadership is looking for us to execute. 2 was brought up by Colonel Sleeper, our Chief Staff of the Air Force, General Brown's 8-page Accelerate, Change, or Lose document. And 3, regardless of what MAJCOM you're in, each of our MAJCOMs, our major commands, are codifying in an annex their ACE employment concept. And that's going to be critical because on the tactical edge, at the tip of the spear, we're going to have to be executing that. So hats off to whoever's at that, but I would say don't drop your head. Man, what an exciting time to be there now, because I will tell you, our 20-year fight in the future starts now. And that's training our airmen, because I'm not going to be fighting that fight. That's Airman so-and-so, that's Lieutenant so-and-so is going to be forward out there. So it's get those individuals ready, not just in executing, but a way of thinking. Over.
Thanks, John. This really great point. It's starting with those airmen, and it's starting with those lieutenants today are really going to be the ones that are charged with taking this on. So with that, we'll kind of segue to you, Colonel Sleeper. You're developing capability for tomorrow's airmen, for these airmen and second lieutenants that are just coming in right now. What are you thinking about that from a logistics perspective that you'll see them operating here in a few years? Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, JB, and thanks for letting me go after John Nolan after that amazing recap of his time and what's going to be happening and what we can expect. Because let me tell you, when he says it's complex, that is exactly the word that I would use as well. So capability development, a cross-functional team, just really quickly to baseline. That's why we were stood up and charged, and we are charged with facilitating concept-based capability development to close the gaps and fill those requirements that we are needed to support that future fight. So there's my one bandwagon kind of thing about what CFTs do. But specific to what John was just talking about, and he already talked about it previously when he kind of gave a little summary of the logistics under attack concept, we are looking at specific discrete capabilities that are absolutely within those 4 lines of effort: posture the force, improve deployment and distribution, mitigate and recover from enemy attack, and then improving our log C2 so that we can observe and orient and make decisions at the right level, at the right time, with the right information to give the best recommendations to our senior leaders, or to make those decisions at the level that we need to be able to make them. So I would say back to what John Nolan was just talking about, I just kept hearing it over and over, and his thoughts were the ability for us to have log IT systems that are, again, that word resilient and survivable are key. Log C2 is so key to be able to, within the JAD C2 construct, that joint all-domain command and control construct, is going to be key to be able to giving our inside the fight folks, those guys that are right there in it, the information that they need. So as a cross-functional team, initially we collected capability development that was widespread, and there is so much going on in the Air Force right now. We've got innovation efforts. The Vice Chief has an innovation challenge, and constantly within the A57 and Air Force Futures, we're constantly looking at, hey, what's the next best thing? But specifically, I think for investments for our airmen right now that will help sustain tomorrow's fight, we're looking at things that we can advocate for this year in the FY23 POM. So things like support equipment modernization. Everybody that's probably listening right now knows how important it is for that to happen. It has to happen for the ACE, for us to be able to support agile combat employment, concepts of employment. It has to happen for us to fight in the future, it has to happen for us to fight tonight, quite frankly. So that's something big right now, specifically. Log C2, I already talked about it. We are absolutely trying to get after that. And there's a lot that goes into Log C2. There's a lot that goes into our log IT systems. And we have a lot of IT systems that work, all of them working on the Nipper side, if almost all of them, that have to be, that we have to be aware of. We're also taking a look, as I already mentioned, at supply chain risk management. So that gets after just really making sure that we understand the bigger picture of where, from the defense industrial base to the point of need, where all our stuff comes from, how it's repaired, who's doing those repairs, who owns the companies that's doing those repairs. And then if you get into making sure that that our systems are tight enough that we don't end up with a part at Kadena that was meant to be at Spangdahlem. So it all ties together in the end. Some of the other specific things that we might be looking at, we expect rocket cargo logistics, kind of a far out thing that we might once thought of. To me personally, it comes right before a transporter from Star Trek. But really, this is not that far away, that we can move logistics assets and potentially even people from point A to point B in minutes instead of days. It's pretty amazing, and we expect that Vanguard to be approved within the Department of the Air Force really soon. And finally, I think our Rapid Global Mobility Fit functional integration team within the A57, they're looking at some pretty cool things, some potential vertical takeoff and landing capabilities. Fletch already touched on our need for runway independence, some short takeoff and landing capabilities. Those different types of capabilities are in various stages of maturity as a capability, and it's really, really hard to keep track of everything. But I think that being able, as a cross-functional team, to have a button on all the various things that are going on between everything that fits within those 4 lines of effort within Log C or the Logistics Under Attack Capability Development Team, it allows us better crosstalk. It allows us to keep from potentially duplicating efforts, and certainly working past each other. We don't want to do that, but it's one place to keep tabs and to be able to get the word out, so that in the end, we give our airmen that need those capabilities the product that they're asking for, that they're demanding. Over.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. So the mobility fit has really taken on some awesome challenges, and to be able to see rocket cargo come to fruition, you're right. It feels like Star Trek or Star Wars, but my gosh, it's coming really soon. There are things coming online, Dragon Cart palletized munitions, which is going to have big impacts for the logistics community and the airport and munitions community. So we're excited to see those coming online. But I'll take it back to you, Colonel Steeves. You're writing the adaptive operations in a contested environment strategic requirements document. Your charge was kind of shepherding that on. Can you kind of describe for us what that means to you? We've talked about the inside fight. We've talked about what a contested environment means. We've dived into the adaptive operations a little bit. Pull the thread for us and the audience on what adaptive operations is, and we'll go from there. Sure.
Well, JB, I wish I could take credit for writing that document. It's a wonderful document, adaptive operations in contested environment. It was really done by Lieutenant Colonel Nolan's team, the Skunks. But it is our foundational document that we use in our team to guide our way through the future. So I'd say that in certain ways, even though we didn't write it, our team is in charge with helping implement it. It's a vice chairman or a vice chief of staff of the Air Force signed document, and it was approved last year at the Capability Development Council. But big picture, I guess if you're to call out a definition of it, it's an enterprise level approach to our force employment and our force development to be able to project power into, but also operate from these contested and highly contested environments that we've kind of really just covered. Now there's I would say that this adaptive operations in contested environments, that's the overall umbrella for how we were going to change the way that we fight in the future. But it's also got subcomponents, in agile combat employment, which is the part that we're really trying to advance in our team, is really the MAGCOM specific approach, or the COCOM specific approach to this adaptive operations concept. So obviously the threat, the terrain, and there's countless differences between Europe and Asia, right? And therefore, ACE needs to be adaptable in that regard. And so we've got to tailor these solutions to the appropriate environment. So I would say the big buzz phrase that exists in this concept is that this is an operationally driven approach. It's underpinned by command and control, but it's all bounded by logistics. So we recognize for this to happen, the logistical piece is absolutely crucial to transforming into the Air Force that we need. So I guess I think part of your question is really, what does this environment look like? So basically I see a contested environment in the future. If we end up unfortunately in some sort of conflict, again, this is kind of like a Back to the Future type idea, where we need to expect to see casualties in ways that we've never been accustomed to in the recent future. I envision an environment where we must operate in an agile and dispersed nature. I see airmen and guardians that need to be empowered through mission command. Mission command was something that wasn't in my vocabulary until I think I was a senior major. But I think it's really something that the Army has taken very seriously, and it's part of their joint doctrine. But what I mean by mission command is kind of like what Colonel Sleeper and Colonel Nolan were talking about earlier, is that you are empowering your airmen to accomplish their tasks without clear guidance. If we get cut off from the mothership and our comms are down and we don't get to play the Mother May I game, we need to have leaders out there that are ready to take action, meaningful action, to get the mission done. And I think that's kind of really what we mean by mission command. And I guess maybe the last point I'll make in this regard is this trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. So I guess that the point that I'll try to make here is that, for the longest time, or I would say for our recent history, the Air Force has been razor focused, and I would say the military in general, or maybe society in general, on being as efficient as possible. So the way that we present our forces right now, and the way that we're trying to change, is you go out and we do these exercises and we see aircraft lined up one next to the other, and then we all take off and land on these big runways, and that's super efficient, right? We can generate combat power. It's very convenient to get the gas and refuel the jets and then take them off one after the other, and that's efficient. But what it isn't, it's not going to be effective in the future fight. It's for us to be effective, we need to start thinking about how to disperse these aircrafts. So one missile doesn't take out all of our combat power. So one or two well-placed munitions doesn't crater our runway to the point where we can't use it anymore. So that's why we're really looking to figure out ways to move beyond this main operating base construct where our targets are really vulnerable. Back to you.
Sir, those are great points. When you talk about this isn't new to us, I think Salty Demo 85, and we've had this conversation before, where we were running, dispersed ops out of Spangdahlem, and we were blowing up runways. Those were things that we have done before, and there are airmen that are still that still remember that, and I think it's important we remember those lessons. You mentioned a key word in there that I don't think we talk about enough, and that's the word attrition. It is not a conversation that we've had recently, because we haven't had to, but I think that's something we're going to need to start pulling the thread on and having hard conversations across our community of how we deal with attrition. And that's not just equipment and material, but it's going to be personnel as well too. So Colonel Sleeper, we'll go around a little bit, and I want to kind of continue this adaptive operations thread here. So from your perspective within the Lua CFT, what do we need to be doing to make, to have a resilient supply chain and posture to make adaptive operations credible for this future fight?
Thanks, JB. So two different things, sort of, but certainly linked with our posture and supply chain. I've touched on supply chain risk management a couple of times already, so don't need to belabor that protection of our global supply chain and technology assets. But I think we should be thinking about, and we already are thinking about through the sustainment strategy framework, the need to have a flexible and fast way to produce parts and equipment that have limited depot capability or contracts. Again, that's something we should be thinking about. I think we haven't touched so much yet in this discussion on our partnership with our allies and partners and how important that is. So what can we do not only to lay in some things that we need to be able to partner with them when we need to, but also to help them help themselves. So that I think that's key to posture as well. I think we need some back and forth kind of between posture and supply chain resiliency, some industrial-based partnership to ensure some capability and adaptability exists. And maybe some growth of new sources of production that's going to be needed for that resilient supply chain and effective supply chain. We could look at this from a persistent logistics lens as well. In the A4, we've been really thinking about that idea of posture, sense, and respond to be able to posture and set those conditions for success. It's not just about WRM. It's about training multi-capable airmen, that definition and the training to that, pre-positioned equipment, and what does that really mean? It's not just WRM, but how do we change that? A lot of modernization. John Nolan's already talked about some hardening and deceptive measures, some CCD measures, but certainly within sense, I've touched on Log C2, and I think that's again, modernized IT systems, leveraging AI, and those robust and resilient communications that we need. And then finally, from a respond perspective, again, we may have already touched about, but rapid, resilient implementation of distribution options, whether that's new platforms, whether that's aerial port of the future kind of technology that we're looking at, or whether that's just simply shifting to a push logistics in that post cyber denied environment that we need to be thinking about and be ready for to be able to act in that adaptive environment that we expect to have to live within in the future fight. Honestly, one of the key things too that I think that we need to be thinking about and that needs to happen, and I think this panel is just one way of showing that we are trying really hard to do this, is for operators and logisticians to be in the room at the same time at the beginning of planning instead of at the end. Instead of waiting till the end of planning and just saying, okay, over to you, logistics, show us that logistics feasibility, give us the feasibility of what we just planned for. We need to be able to talk and ask those questions while we're building the plan. And that's not just while we're building a plan at a MAGCOM or a COCOM, it's at the base level as well. And then, so that would allow us earlier and often to make those tweaks to make adaptive operations credible and feasible. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. It isn't more, I think the beauty of Air Force Futures is the fact that we are so integrated closely with each other. Operations, logistics, acquisitions, mission support, working together to create functional plans. It's not just, hey, throw it over the fence and I got it. And then we have to figure out, all right, well, what do we do with this? And there has been tight integration. John, you being over there in the skunks, working those concepts has been really key to this. We just came out of the Chief of Staff Sustaining Combat Power Assessment Workshop just yesterday. And one of the things that we really discovered or going through and really were trying to work through was the commercial industry piece to this, which you referred to in the defense industrial base. But in my mind, it's not just the defense industrial base, but it's also our commercial partners in transportation as well through Visa and Craft. You know, how do we, or when do we sit down with them and say, okay, here is the problem, this is your problem too, let's work together to kind of come to some cooperative solutions on this, because we have to have this conversation with them. And I think what it comes back to ultimately is the same discussion and the same problem we as logisticians have been nugging through over the course of the last few years, which is one of timelines. You know, these timelines are really, really stringent. So with that, you know, John, I'll throw it back to you. When we talk timelines, what should logisticians be thinking about in the speed of this future fight? Over.
Hey, thanks, JB. You brought up a great point about when do we sit down with our industrial base, those other organizations to discuss this. I would say it was yesterday, because I say that because our adversaries are already assessing that capability and how they can interdict those operations already. So if we're not doing it yesterday, we're probably behind the power curve. So I say we start now. When you talk about particular timelines in respects to what logisticians need to respond to, I would say it's nothing different in respects to our design operational capability, our doc statements, our tip bids, and understanding the synchronization of items, resources coming into your respective backyard to play in engaging and employing combat power. Here's what I would say though. As a logistician, I've always felt behind the power curve. If I did not have certain actions accomplished left of a warning order or a deployment order. I say that to say, be involved in those respective intel meetings that are discussing indications and warning. Understand the deception and tactical deception of how forward your organization can lean forward in prepping the battlefield for ensured success of generating combat power without tipping off the adversary. So bottom line, it would not only be short timelines from which deployment of combat forces is required, but more importantly, I would assess is the timeline in which the employment of those combat forces will be required in the theater. Sometimes we think of it in chops. We think of getting to the fight, and once we're there, get everything ready, and then fight. It is deploying into the fight. Those are simultaneous operations that I don't believe sometimes we have concentrated on as much as we've needed to. So I would say thus the importance of sequencing deployment of combat forces to marry with pre-positioned assets, again, with the understood intent to rapidly and successfully employ those combat forces. Over.
No, John, so we're going to throw an audible here. So you mentioned a magic acronym, and AFWIC and Air Force Futures have kind of toyed with this acronym a little bit in the past. So the tip fid, does the tip fid deploy in a time relevant fashion still? Over to you.
Absolutely. When bombs aren't dropping and the adversary is not placing their vote into how things synchronize into the theater to combat them. Absolutely. So joking aside, I would say it deserves, as with everything else, as we look to be not necessarily just efficient, but effective, it needs to be assessed. Does it meet the Joint Force Commander's intent? He or she who's sitting in that seat is the individual that determines the viability of a tip fit and if it's meeting their intent. We've all set on the end of being a supporting individual of wanting our items there first. If we can't tie that to how it's going to lead to meeting the Joint Force Commander's objectives, then we are missing the point. Again, I would tell you to get into the National Defense Strategy, look at those particular models out there in respects to the particular layers that we're looking to lay out across to ensure Joint Force Commanders are prepared in timelines to respond effectively to adversarial commitments towards us. Over.
John, I appreciate that audible. That was a phenomenal answer. So, Colonel Steeves, well, we've got a few more questions left, but I want to ask you, you're an operator, you've grown up in that community. You've been getting your feet very wet within the logistics side of the house. When you look at the future fight, what are the logistics concerns what are the logistics areas that concern you the most moving into the future fight? Over.
Well, thanks, JB. I think I'll have to. I know we've had a few sidebar conversations with Maggie and you, and so I'll probably have to defer to your judgment as the experts, but I can provide my opinion here. And I would say, based on some of our conversations and all the learning I've done by virtue of being able to collaborate with you guys at the staff and learn the logistics perspective, is I think of energy. I'd probably put that at the top of the list for logistical challenges. I mean, our boss, Lieutenant General Highnote, says it all the time. He recognizes that fuels are bulky and they're heavy and they're hard to move around. And then worst of all, right, is we are completely dependent on them to operate and fight how we're currently postured to do so. And it's going to be tough to get. This is daunting to figure out a way to refuel aircraft, via tankers or transporting fuel to the front lines and so on. I mean, we've talked about this already, that it's going to be hard. I mean, you're going to have to come up with some sort of industry arrangement to sweet talk our industry partners into sailing a ship into the threat of a missile engagement. That's going to be tough, and that's just one of the things. I guess the thing, I don't mean to paint an entirely grim picture on this either, because I'm very heartened by the fact that AFWERX right now is leading what they're calling an energy challenge. So they're partnering right now with industry, and we're trying to figure out a way to pivot away from this fossil fuel dependence. Basically to reimagine energy for the future of the DoD, and that would play out in spades for the type of programs that I'm working on, with the next generation of UAVs and agile combat employment. If we didn't have to get fuel to these dispersed locations, or we could take some sort of high speed VTOL that runs on a battery that who knows could be repowered by the sun. I mean, this is all futuristic stuff. I mean, that could solve a lot of our problems. We start looking at different energy solutions in that regard. But yeah, I think that this energy could become a crippling vulnerability to our joint force if not addressed. Over.
Colonel Steeves, thank you for that. So that's a great point. We look at bulk petroleum distribution throughout the COCOMs. That is a very daunting challenge that we're going to have to get at. Being able to look at energy revolution isn't just about climate change. It's fundamental, and for DoD, it's fundamentally going to be about how do we sustain the fight. But so I have one more question left. Thank you guys so much for your patience today. I'll throw it out to Colonel Sleeper. Ma'am, you've been here on the staff for a little while. When you look at logisticians coming into Air Force Futures, what kind of logisticians do you want to see coming into the team as we create the architecture for the future Air Force? Over, ma'am.
Thanks, JB. So yes, I have been on the staff way too long. And I've had the pleasure to work with A5, but full disclosure, I am an A4. So when I look at who I would think would be a great person to go into Air Force Futures, putting aside some current experience in either Indo-PACOM or EUCOM within that AOR, because that's not everything that we need, but we really need well-rounded logisticians grounded in their core logistics functional areas. And they must be able to think analytically. They must be able to be willing to think outside the box. And sometimes that's hard for some of us, but sometimes it's not. But not only do you have to think outside the box, but you have to be able to work well with teams, and you can't be afraid to open your mouth. You have to be the SME in the room, because I know you guys will say it. I know I've been in this. I spent about 6 years in the A3 on the half staff, and often you're the only person in the room that's a logistician, whether you're a maintainer or whether you're a an LRO that has really grown up in the aerial port or in an LRS or at the scout. So you're the person when they say, okay, who's the logistician? You have to be willing to open your mouth and say, hey, I don't know that answer, but I'll find it. Or be able to make that decision or recommendation right then. You can't be a flower on the wall in Air Force Futures. So that's just my 2 cents, but you may have some other opinions, and I know John Nolan does probably as well. So, but that's my 2 cents looking in. Over.
John, I think you just got called out for your second audible. So what do you see on your side being up there in the skunks? Over.
Colonel Sleeper hit it all on the spot. I think thinking outside the box and looking at the bigger picture. What I've kind of understood, and I've seen a lot of the LROs and maintainers that I work alongside, and I would say everybody on the 5 and the 4 staff, is that we accumulate and look at the problem set as that we're working for the airmen at the wing level. We kind of put ourselves back there, but we raise ourselves one level higher and say, what can we do at the staff level to give the tools and resources to those airmen in the future at the wing level? Be it in policy, be it in resourcing, what can we do to give them the tools? Because we know they will perform the mission. General Brown said it best, empower those airmen because they can't solve the problem. And that's what we're doing up here. So come with that mindset and we'll do our future airmen right in a future fight. Over.
So team, thank you so much for this. This has been a great conversation. Any last remarks before we end it here? Colonel Nolan, I see you raise your hand.
One word I didn't bring up, I would like to bring up is deterrent. And the reason why I bring that up is in respects to all the complex problems and hard problems that we identify. Although complex and hard, I think are exciting for us to look to seek to provide solutions to. But if we can solve them and then also provide that narrative that our adversary can see, it provides a potential deterrent to a near peer attacking us. So I don't want to lose that logistics could be a deterrent. And I think that's an important factor to understand and acknowledge. Over.
All right, thank you very much. All right,
Jake,
oh, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, from my foxhole here over in the staff, I would just like to relate, a couple things. I'm working on agile combat employment, but I think I also mentioned that we're working on the next generation of RIVEs, autonomous capable, platforms and collaborative platforms, excuse me. And we're working really hard to try to figure out how to integrate artificial intelligence, come up with a new jet engine and all these things that are going to make it survivable, from a very technical point of view. But I'll tell you what, those challenges seem relatively easy compared to the logistical challenges of this venture. I've got an F-22 crew chief on our team that's working really hard to try to figure out, how can we take off without runways, and how can we resupply, how can we get people and to these dispersed locations. And I think on the surface you would think that developing with the Air Force Research Lab and all this technology, that would be the hard part. But we've learned from our war games and everything else is it's logistics that's the real heavy lift on this portfolio item for me. So just for the greater audience out there, keep that in mind. Over.
All right, thank you very much, sir. All right, well, hey, this has been a wonderful conversation. Love talking with you guys about this. We'll continue this conversation with folks out there in LOA. We wish we could be there in person with you. We can have these sidebar conversations afterwards and can pepper your questions. But with that, thank you very much. And out here from the NCR.